Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today we are checking out AMD's RX 9060 XT. Specifically, we are looking at the 16GB model because, again, the 8GB message just does not seem to be sinking in with these giant corporations. However, putting that aside for now, the 16GB card at least does appear to be very good value on paper, coming in with just a £315 MSRP, making it the only current-gen GPU to offer more than 12GB of VRAM for under £400. Interested? Well, let's dive in. If you missed the announcement back at Computex 2025 then, AMD is launching two RX 9060 XT GPUs. We have the 8GB model with an MSRP of £270 or $299, and we do find that one just as egregious as the 8GB 5060 Ti, but there is also a 16GB model, and this one has an MSRP of £315 or $350. Both models are hitting the market tomorrow, and we're told to expect good supply here in the UK and that prices should be a lot more stable around MSRP this time, so fingers crossed. In terms of its specs, it's using a new Navi 44 die, of course still based on the RDNA 4 architecture. In a nutshell though, if you took a 9070 XT and chopped it in half, you'd more or less end up with a 9060 XT, given it has 32 compute units and ray accelerators, 64 ROPs and a 128-bit memory interface. It's still packing 16GB of GDDR6 memory at 20GB speeds, resulting in total memory bandwidth of 322GB a second, while power comes rated at 160 watts. It is worth pointing out that there's no reference design, just like the 9070 and 9070 XT, so instead AMD sampled us with this ASUS Prime model. This is technically an overclocked unit, but regular viewers will know I test all of my GPUs for these day one reviews at reference spec anyway, so it's an apples to apples comparison. All of our testing as well is done with our regular GPU test system, and this is powered by MSI. It's packing an AMD Ryzen 7 9800X3D CPU paired with 64GB of Kingston Fury Beast DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, plus we've got that paired with the MSI MPG X870E Carbon Wi-Fi motherboard. All testing as well was done using MSI's MPG 321 URX QD-OLED monitor. The final thing to say though, just before we do dive in, is that in this video we are focusing on the 1080p and 1440p data. I did test at 4K as well, and if you want to see every single one of the 225 charts I made for this review, you can do so over in the written review at kitguru.net, and I'll leave a link to that down in the description. Kicking off the game benchmarks then with Alan Wake 2. At 1080p, the RX 9060 XT 16GB is dead level with both RTX 5060 Ti models. All three GPUs are hitting just over 60 FPS using the high preset, while AMD's newest GPU is just 5% slower than the RX 7700 XT. At 1440p, things are still very close with the two 5060 Ti models, this time with performance just over 40 FPS, so it is playable, but you'd likely want to tinker with the settings or enable upscaling for smoother frame rates. Black Myth Wukong remains more favourable to Nvidia GPUs, and it also doesn't have a problem with 8GB cards either at 1080p or 1440p, at least not without ray tracing being enabled. Here the 9060 XT 16GB comes in 15% slower than the 5060 Ti 8GB, while it's on par with the 7700 XT. 1440p though is just way too demanding for this calibre of GPU when testing with the cinematic preset, so again you will want to dial down the quality in this title. Cyberpunk 2077 is much more performant though by modern standards, and at 1080p ultra settings we're looking at just over 100 FPS for the 9060 XT, again putting it on par with the 7700 XT. Versus the Nvidia competition, it's 7% slower than the two 5060 Ti models. 1440p is no problem either with an average of 67 FPS, this time making the 9060 XT 6% slower than the 5060 Ti, while it's 39% faster than its predecessor, the RX 7600 XT. Dragon Age: The Veilguard is another game which runs better on Nvidia hardware, and we can see that with the 9060 XT 16GB only level with the RTX 4060 Ti, making it 14% slower than the 5060 Ti 16GB. However, VRAM becomes a significant factor at 1440p, where the 9060 XT 16GB actually comes in 26% faster than the 5060 Ti 8GB, and that's without any ray tracing. The AMD GPU is still 12% slower than the 5060 Ti 16GB, but it does show how important VRAM can be. Final Fantasy XVI is next, and this shows a small lead for the 9060 XT 16GB over both 5060 Ti models, admittedly by just a couple of FPS, but it is a small win for Team Red at 1080p. At 1440p, the 1% lows though do drop below 30 FPS, so again, it's another situation where either upscaling or lowering the image quality settings would be required. Ghost of Tsushima though continues to be a very strong title for AMD GPUs, or more accurately, it's a nightmare game for Nvidia hardware for some reason I don't quite understand. Here we can see the 9060 XT 16GB coming in 14% faster than both 5060 Ti models at 1080p, hitting 77 FPS on average. 1440p also shows a similar trend, although shout out to the Intel Arc B580 for also hugely overperforming in this game. Moving on to Horizon Forbidden West though, this is a title that perfectly encapsulates the issues with 8GB GPUs, even at 1080p with ray tracing not even supported in this game. 8GB cards just can't play smoothly at very high settings, with the 9060 XT 16GB about twice as fast as the 5060 Ti 8GB, but on par with the 5060 Ti 16GB model. The same also goes for 1440p, where the 9060 XT still delivers very strong performance, averaging just below 60 FPS, where it's again level with the 5060 Ti 16GB. There's no such VRAM constraint in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 though, where AMD GPUs continue to lag behind their Nvidia rivals, given the 9060 XT 16GB is 16% slower than both 5060 Ti models. It does however show strong gains for RDNA 4 over RDNA 3, given that the GPU is actually on par with the RX 7800 XT in this title. The 9060 XT 16GB does fall away slightly at 1440p relative to the 7800 XT, but it's still very playable in this well-optimized game, averaging 55 FPS with tight 1% lows. A Plague Tale Requiem is next, and we get more decent performance at 1080p from the 9060 XT 16GB, averaging 74 FPS and making it 7% slower than both 5060 Ti models. 1440p is similar, where it is again neck and neck with the 7700 XT, though this time it comes in 9% slower than the 5060 Ti 16GB. Ratchet and Clank is unfortunately another game where AMD GPUs do struggle, this time showing the 9060 XT 16GB lagging behind the 5060 Ti 16GB by 15%. However, it's also a game where there's a clear benefit to having more than 8GB of VRAM, even at 1080p without ray tracing, given the AMD GPU is no less than 32% faster than the 5060 Ti 8GB model. Up at 1440p, the 9060 XT 16GB is still playable, hitting 64 FPS on average, though again it still lags behind the 5060 Ti 16GB, but clearly beats the 8GB card. Senua Saga's Hellblade 2 is up next, and this is another title where things are very even between the 9060 XT 16GB and the two 5060 Ti models. There's no benefit to having more than 8GB of VRAM here, and all three GPUs average just below 60 FPS at 1080p. At 1440p, the AMD GPU does fall slightly further behind, though not by much, as it's still only 5% slower than the 5060 Ti 16GB, and it's also dead level with the 7700 XT. Lastly, we finish up our raster benchmarks with Starfield, a game that used to favour AMD hardware, but several updates and possibly driver tweaks have changed that behaviour. Still, 50 FPS at 1080p isn't bad, though it is a touch behind the 7700 XT and 9% slower than the 5060 Ti 16GB. 1440p resolution sees that deficit increase to a 10% margin, though we do have to remember that the 9060 XT 16GB has a 21% lower MSRP than the 5060 Ti 16GB.
If you're looking for a new chair, then definitely go and check out boolies.co.uk. They offer a whole host of gaming and office chairs that come in a variety of different finishes and different colours.
Overall then, at 1080p, our 12-game geomean data shows that the RX 9060 XT 16GB is dead level with the RX 7700 XT. It's 4% faster than the 5060 Ti 8GB, but then 6% slower than the 5060 Ti 16GB, although again, that's pretty good considering the difference in MSRP. It's a capable 1440p GPU as well, still about level with the 7700 XT, but now 8% faster than the 5060 Ti 8GB, or 7% slower than the 5060 Ti 16GB. We've not spoken too much about the RX 7600 XT today either, but as the realistic predecessor to the 9060 XT 16GB, the new GPU is 38% faster on average. To look into the comparison versus the 5060 Ti 16GB a little closer though, the 9060 XT 16GB proved slower in 8 of the 12 games tested. While it was faster in the other 4, 3 of those 4 showed differences of less than 5%, with Ghost of Tsushima being the only game where the AMD GPU was noticeably faster. At 1440p, the 9060 XT scales just slightly worse compared to the 5060 Ti 16GB, as we saw it come in 7% slower on average, but again, 4 of the 12 games show it behind by more than a 10% margin. That being said, the comparison versus the 5060 Ti 8GB is a completely different story. Some of the games do still perform the same, but there's a couple of clear examples where, even at 1080p, an 8GB frame buffer just does not cut it anymore, resulting in huge wins for the 9060 XT 16GB. Those trends are only exacerbated at 1440p too. Just look at that result for Horizon Forbidden West. As for what that data though means in terms of cost per frame, here we're using the UK launch MSRPs, and the 9060 XT 16GB is comfortably the best value GPU we've tested. In fact, AMD holds every spot on the podium, with the 9070 XT and 9070 in 2nd and 3rd place respectively. Versus the 5060 Ti 16GB, the 9060 XT 16GB is 16% cheaper per frame. Those margins barely change at 1440p, with the 9060 XT 16GB now 15% cheaper per frame compared to the 5060 Ti 16GB. Its lead over the 9070 XT has shrunk, however, to just a 2% difference. Of course though, the picture does change when looking at data based on the current street pricing. The 9060 XT 16GB does still top the chart, but Intel's B580 has shot up, considering it can be found for just £260 at the moment. The 9060 XT 16GB is still leading the value race at 1440p too, again not by much over the B580, but compared to the RTX 5070, which is Nvidia's best value GPU based on our data, it's still 8% cheaper per frame. Moving on to ray tracing though, there's clearly been a huge improvement from RDNA 3 to RDNA 4 in this department, given the 9060 XT 16GB is actually level with the RX 7900 GRE in Alan Wake at 1080p, but sadly that still doesn't make it playable even at 1080p resolution with quality upscaling being used. The same goes for Black Myth Wukong, another highly demanding title when using path tracing. Even at 1080p with quality upscaling, performance just isn't playable on this sort of GPU. You'd really need an RX 9070 as the bare minimum. Cyberpunk 2077, however, is not nearly so tough when using the Ultra preset but with no upscaling. Here the 9060 XT 16GB managed 47 FPS on average, making it a touch faster than the 7800 XT, but of course it is still well behind Nvidia as it's about 16% slower than the 5060 Ti 16GB. Indiana Jones is next, and this one is well documented for requiring more than 8GB of VRAM. We had loads of crashes just trying to complete the benchmark on the 5060 Ti 8GB, but performance is very solid on the 9060 XT 16GB, averaging 84 FPS. That does mean it's actually slower than the 7700 XT though, and still 11% behind the 5060 Ti 16GB. There are clear gains to be seen in Ratchet and Clank though, given the 9060 XT 16GB is only 3 FPS behind the 7900 GRE. Once more, VRAM is a huge issue for 8GB cards, and the 9060 XT 16GB is 32% faster than the 5060 Ti 8GB. Returnal is a much less demanding title with ray tracing enabled though. Here performance for the 9060 XT 16GB isn't any better than the 7700 XT, which is a little disappointing. That means it is still some 15% slower than even the 5060 Ti 8GB. The same also goes for Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Utilising just ray trace shadows is not particularly demanding. That's good though, as FPS is still very high for this GPU, but performance is only on par with the 7700 XT and about 17% behind the 5060 Ti 16GB. Lastly then, we finish up with Star Wars Outlaws, a title that doesn't perform particularly well on Nvidia's Blackwell GPUs, and as such, the 9060 XT 16GB is actually level with both 5060 Ti models at 1080p. Overall then, there's no doubt that ray tracing has improved significantly from RDNA 3. We can see that as the 9060 XT is on par with the 7800 XT, despite being the slower GPU in our rasterization tests. It's also an eye-watering 78% faster than the RX 7600 XT, despite that number being closer to 38% for our raster benchmarks. However, there is no getting away from the fact that Nvidia still has the upper hand when it comes to ray tracing. Compared to the 5060 Ti 16GB, the 9060 XT 16GB is some 23% slower, though it does still average a higher frame rate compared to the 5060 Ti 8GB thanks to its superior VRAM capacity. Now, I did mention upscaling a few times during that last segment, and of course FSR 4 is a big part of these new RDNA 4 GPUs. Now, I did take a more in-depth look at this as part of the 9070 XT review back in March, so I won't go over everything again, but there's no denying the technology is a huge improvement over FSR 3.1 in just about every way. It's so much more detailed with significantly less sizzling, distortion, ghosting, and general artifacting that made FSR 3.1 quite unpleasant to use at times. I'm showing it here on the 9060 XT running at 1440p using the quality mode versus native 1440p, and the gains are very solid overall, often in the 15 to 25% range, if not more depending on the game, and that can mean going from sub 60 FPS at this resolution to over 60 FPS at all times, so it is a great addition to have for this GPU. The one thing I would say to AMD though is that they really need to be very aggressive about getting support into more games. They have announced over 60 games supporting FSR 4 as of June the 5th, but compare that to Nvidia DLSS, which has had such a head start, and you really can see the scale of the task ahead of them.
With 20 years of PC manufacturing experience, CyberPower PC are the best in the business. With the largest range of parts available in the UK, our team of experienced builders will expertly build and test each system to be delivered to you the very next day. Check out cyberpowersystem.co.uk.
Changing gear for a moment though, it's time to move on and take a look at the ASUS Prime partner card itself. If you have seen the Prime series before, you'll know what to expect. It's got a clean black plastic shroud, the side curved neatly over, giving it an almost unibody appearance, plus it has a metal backplate and a dual BIOS switch as well. I'd argue it is perhaps unnecessarily large considering the relatively low power requirements, given it's a triple fan cooler and it measures 304 by 126 by 50mm. But it will fit in the vast majority of ATX cases we'd expect, and power comes from just a single 8-pin. The only really weird thing is just 3 display outputs with 2 DisplayPort 2.1 and 1 HDMI 2.1, so hopefully that's not going to be a huge compromise for any of you watching. Testing both the performance and quiet BIOS modes on the ASUS Prime does reveal a small difference between the two, with the performance running slightly faster as we'd expect. Averaged over our 30-minute stress test, it hit 2,986 MHz compared to 2,937 MHz for the quiet BIOS. The performance BIOS also has a clear advantage when it comes to thermal performance, given the GPU hit just 47 degrees in my testing, with the hotspot at 66 degrees. The quiet BIOS of course does run warmer, but it's still well within safe limits given the hotspot hit 80.1 degrees. Memory temperature also follows a similar trend, with the performance BIOS hitting 78 degrees, while the quiet BIOS saw that figure increase by 12 degrees. That is definitely a bit warmer, but we did also observe similar during our 9070 XT reviews. Noise levels though of the ASUS Prime are absolutely fantastic, it has to be said. The quiet BIOS actually saw the fans run below 800 RPM, and that didn't even register on my sound meter. The performance BIOS only increased speed to 1350 RPM as well, so it's still very easy on the ears, making this a very, very quiet graphics card. As for power draw then, as a reminder, here we do use Nvidia's PCAT tool, so we can measure power draw on a per game, per resolution basis. So this means for every game we test at every single resolution, we also have power draw data for every single one of the GPUs tested. Of course, that does mean there is a ton of data to go through, and we're not going to do all of that in this video, but if you do want to see all of those charts, head to kitguru.net. For now though, we're going to take a look at the 12 game average results. With that in mind, power draw of our ASUS Prime model came in right in line with AMD's claimed 160 watt TDP. Over the 12 games tested at 1080p, it averaged 158.1 watts, so it's actually more frugal than the RX 7600 XT, despite being much faster. At 1440p as well, power draw really doesn't change much. It's still just below the rated limit, averaging 159.1 watts over my testing, so power draw is now very similar to the 5060 Ti 16GB, as you can see in this chart. As for what that power testing and performance data means in terms of overall efficiency, it's not bad at all, but it's not chart-topping either. Efficiency is really very similar to the RTX 40 series GPUs, and even then, the 9060 XT 16GB is only 11% less performance per watt than the 5060 Ti 16GB, so we're talking relatively small margins, which we would expect considering all of these GPUs are effectively on the same node. At 1440p, relative efficiency of the 9060 XT 16GB does increase slightly, given it's now just 7% less efficient than the 5060 Ti 16GB, while it's the RX 9070 non-XT that tops the chart at this resolution. That really does just go to show how far AMD has come since the RDNA 3 architecture, given just how far down the chart the likes of the 7700 XT and 7600 XT are coming in. After all of that testing then, there is no denying that the AMD RX 9060 XT 16GB is a very compelling option for those shopping in the sub £350 GPU market. Rasterization performance is highly competitive for one thing, coming within 6% of the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB on average at 1080p, while it matches the RX 7700 XT blow for blow. It's a capable option at 1440p as well, though some compromises may be needed to maintain high frame rates, especially in newer AAA titles. Still, with a bit of settings tweaking or by enabling upscaling, it's certainly doable. Ray tracing performance also sees significant gains versus RDNA 3, with the RX 9060 XT 16GB often outperforming even the RX 7800 XT in this area. In heavily ray traced titles, it can be over twice as fast as the 7600 XT, though you could argue that doesn't really mean much if the frame rate itself isn't playable. After all, demanding games like Alan Wake 2 and Black Myth Wukong remain a huge challenge, even with quality upscaling enabled at 1080p resolution. Overall, there are clear gains to be seen for the RDNA 4 architecture when it comes to ray tracing, but you have to say Nvidia does still hold the crown here, particularly when it comes to more demanding path-traced games. Where things get really interesting though is when we move on to talk about memory. We've obviously focused on the 9060 XT 16GB today, and one thing is absolutely clear from my testing, you will definitely want more than 8GB of VRAM for playing AAA titles today, let alone 2 to 3 years down the line. Games like Ratchet and Clank, Dragon Age the Veilguard, and Horizon Forbidden West all exceeded 8GB of VRAM usage even before enabling ray tracing, making this AMD GPU faster than the 8GB 5060 Ti on average, simply due to having more VRAM, and in some games, the differences are absolutely huge. Factor in pricing and the fact that the 9060 XT 16GB MSRP is £35 cheaper than the 8GB 5060 Ti and £85 cheaper than the 16GB 5060 Ti, and you can see why I think AMD has a very strong contender on its hands. Yeah, absolutely, I do still think that Nvidia's 5060 Ti 16GB is the better overall product. It's just generally more balanced, bit faster, much better for ray tracing, but it's also 27% more expensive, which is a lot, particularly in this market segment. And as I already mentioned, I have absolutely no doubt in my mind about recommending the 9060 XT 16GB over the 8GB 5060 Ti, which I think at 350 quid is really a terrible buy. The 9060 XT 16GB also looks like a solid upgrade compared to AMD's own stack, considering just how much faster and more efficient it is compared to the 7600 XT, not to mention its support for FSR 4 and the fact that it's launching at basically the same price. Obviously, a lot of that conclusion does come down to pricing, and we can't deny that the 9070 XT's MSRP ended up being a red herring, considering the cheapest options are still retailing for £90 over that £570 MSRP. However, from the conversations we have had with retailers here in the UK, it does sound like it's going to be a different story for the 9060 XT, and the £350 MSRP for the 16GB model sounds like it's going to be much more realistic. If that doesn't end up being the case and pricing does creep within maybe 15, even 10% of the 5060 Ti 16GB, then I do think that GPU may be worth shelling out the extra cash for, so again, it's definitely going to be something we're going to keep our eyes on over the coming weeks and months. The bottom line then, AMD has a very good thing on its hands with the RX 9060 XT 16GB, provided that MSRP materializes. Yes, the company does absolutely deserve just as much stick as Nvidia got for the 8GB model, but with this 16GB option, simply by having that much VRAM at this price point gives it a huge advantage over the competition, not to mention the solid raster performance, much improved ray tracing, and support for FSR 4. Do let us know if you end up buying one. Anyway guys, that is where I'm going to leave this video. So if you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Please do subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to ding that notification bell so you don't miss when we upload a new video. If you want to carry on the conversation as well, you can find a link to our Discord server down in the description, and while you're there you can also find links to our merch store and our Patreon if you want to consider backing us over there. That is it for this one though guys, I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.